Welcome. r/malicious compliance. My neighbors wanted to call a professional to mark their property line. My parents agreed. This was a long time ago, but I remember it clearly. We moved into a community with tight space in between our house and our neighbors, and we didn't like them being able to see into our kitchen. We put up a bunch of plants, costing thousands, but my parents thought it would be worth it. A week later my parents awoke to the plants completely chopped down. My father was furious and marched down to our neighbor's house. He told my father the plants were on his property line, therefore he had total right to take them down. He warned that, if anything were to go on his property again, he would report us to the authorities immediately. Later that day my father called the company that put in the plants, and with a warranty we could have them replanted next week for no charge. We made sure there was no way it was on our neighbor's property. However, a few days later we caught him chopping them down at 2 a.m. We called the police upon obstruction of property, and after a chat with my neighbor he decided to call a professional and mark his property line. My father agreed. A few days later I got home to find orange tape in my neighbor's yard. Apparently, his fence was 11 feet over our property line. We watched as he took down his fence, completely furious. Within the next month we were enjoying our new space and privacy in our backyard, and my neighbor ended up losing 1/4 of his backyard. My neighbor ended up having to pay almost $10,000 for the destruction of our property, and we got to plant our plants again. Something similar happened to my parents last year. New neighbor bought the house beside ours, started doing renos without permits, but that's a whole other story, and complained that our fence was on his property and that the new stone walkway leading to the back my stepdad had built the previous summer needed to get dug up and removed along with the fence. My parents tried to reason with him, explaining that all the landlines in the area are all crooked and that everything had been this way for 30 plus years without issue. He wouldn't hear of it and insisted on the removal, so my mom called the city and requested a new eval. After fighting with this guy for months, turns out, not only was the fence on our land, but his new one was on ours as well. His back fence was on the land of the backyard neighbor and same on the other side. My mom got the 3 other houses that bordered his to all get evals as well, so in the end he lost almost half his yard to the surrounding houses. Justice is so very sweet. When I first got out of high school I worked for a land surveyor. This kind of dispute is very common. We had lots of cases where we would have to testify in court, and often a homie owner would be out pulling our locating pins out of the ground nearly as soon as we'd put them in. I told one guy it's fine, the ones that the town put in are still there, we can always put ours back. Next thing you know he's out digging up the granite monument in the street. The police have no sense of humor about that. Same happened to me when I was a kid. There was a wooden fence between our house and the neighbors. My cousin and I were playing on it, and the guy came outside and cursed us out. Told us if he caught us little shits on his property again, there would be hell to pay. I was like 8 years old. I probably was a little shit, but we went inside and told my dad. He got pissed off and went to the guy's front door and they argued over where the property line was. My dad actually built the fence himself years before the neighbor bought their house. My dad called a surveyor. The guy's driveway was between his house and the fence. The property pin was buried about a foot into the guy's driveway. My dad moved the fence the following weekend. The guy couldn't use his driveway. He had to move his concrete retaining wall so he could have just enough room to open his car door. They put up a for sale sign a couple of months later. My parents recently got in a spat with a neighbor over a similar issue. My folks had cleared out some of the neighbor's brush and the neighbor threw a fit. The neighbor worked for a legal firm and she used her company's letterhead, without permission from their company, to try and send a threatening notice over the value of the destroyed plants. They referenced a law written to protect trees, not weeds. They would have been entitled to 3x the cost of the destroyed shrubbery, which would have been around $0. She also delivered it to the mailbox herself, which is illegal. They had a surveyor find the property line, and when it came up 2 to 3 feet too short, they fucking moved. I had a somewhat opposite situation, but it still worked out well. I had to get a survey on my property when I bought it, and it turned out that what had looked like a zero lot line, neighbor's house right at the edge of the lot, was actually a situation where the 4 meters, more or less, between our houses was split down the middle. Now, my backyard looked like it contained a rather large and raggedy tree in the extreme back corner. After the survey, that tree was actually in my neighbor's yard. I decided to replace the fence, as it was old and falling apart anyway, completely at my expense. I explained to my neighbor that I had discovered that he was entitled to more backyard than he thought, and I was going to just put in a new fence at the correctly surveyed location. Neighbor was quite content with this. Unfortunately, a couple of years later, a big storm fell that tree onto the property of his neighbor along his back fence. Oops. That's great. I'm a civil engineer, and when I first moved into my house I put a fence up, because I have 3 dogs. My neighbor behind me got a little upset, really upset, that I put a fence up, and tried to say it was on her property line. Little did she know I literally got the survey information for my house from the company I work for, and that's how I planned where my fence would go as to avoid unnecessary shit like this. After I handed her a copy of the prints I printed out and politely pointed out that my fence was indeed not on her property line, because I do this for a living, she shut right up. Needless to say, I haven't had any issues since. Sometimes it pays to be an engineer when doing general home improvements. Lesson: talk to your neighbors before to make sure you both agree where the line is. I wanted to put in a fence, and some shrubs that have been there years were close to the property line. I did not want to chop down the bushes, but I did not want to put a fence on her side of the line. Talked to neighbor before I scheduled the fence to figure out how to deal with it. We both agreed they were on the line. She let me put the fence on her side to let the bushes live, and I gave her some extra space in a place she was happy to get, and I did not need or want. She ended up paying for half the cost of the fence that bordered her property. Neighbor on the other asslow split that portion of the fence with me because I talked to him first instead of just hiring someone to do it without at least making an effort to be decent about it. I also had to make sure my fence installer pulled a permit because I had an insane guy across the street who loved to screw with contractors. Sure enough, he came over and tried to tell them WHT to do and how to do it. They had to call the police on him. He cost me a few $100s. I could have got it done cheaper with no permit. Fence guy thought I was nuts making him pull a permit. He thanked me later. Insane guy ended up in Baker Act 6 months later after being found wandering the hood naked with a shotgun searching for ninjas. A warning to others: if you and your neighbor are having a property dispute, never ever get a surveyor together. You call a company and have them survey your lot and place signs if required. Then you have a survey. If they want a resurvey of their plot of land, they will call a company, hopefully someone different. Depending on how things are written, deeded over time, combined/split, it's possible to have overlaps and gaps between property. And if it ends up in court, you want to make sure the surveyor you hired is working in your best interest. How many/what kind of plants did you get that cost thousands? We bought dozens of trees and still spent much less than $1,000. Also, I have a neighbor that dug up stakes the surveyor put in and moved them over like 20 feet. He thought moving the stakes moves the property line. Really not sure what the point was, since he owns plenty of land and he was just moving it further in the neighbor's field. But this is the same neighbor that made the same field owning neighbor move a fence. The cow field used to come right up to our yard, so this hillside down to the creek. We actually own about to where the creek is, but this hill isn't good for much and is a pain to cut. Cows mean no cutting. He had to move the fence all the way over to the other side of the creek because dumb neighbor kept insisting the fence across the creek made his yard get flooded. Whenever the creek floods, he is down the creek. If that fence had done anything, catch debris and hold back a little more water, it would be keeping the water from getting to his yard. My neighbor did this to me and my father a few years ago. He had been throwing trash on our side of the property line for decades and we didn't know. Couple years ago, my father wanted to put up a fence, but wanted to make sure that he wasn't going to overstep the property line. We had a vague understanding of where it was, but never really cared to have our land surveyed. So we end up getting the survey done. We learned that he'd been throwing garbage over the line by about 10 feet. So it wasn't an accident that his shed is too close to the line, and we chopped his backyard, just the part directly adjacent to our property line, where the fence was going, down by at least a third. We reclaimed about 15 feet with the survey, but relented 4 feet to build the fence. Why do neighbors try to flex like that? It never works out in their favor. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed the video, hit like. If you would like to see more, feel free to subscribe.